In this case study example, we look at measure and ignore. And to do this, we look at the pearl millet growth in the Sahel case study example. This case study is given in topic 1 in more detail, but just as a brief recap, just recall that the pearl millet growth case study aims to examine factors that influence spatial variation in pearl millet growth. It was a 3-year experiment, and it compared 4 specific data types to assess the effectiveness in reducing variation unrelated to treatment. There are 4 data types that are looked at in this experiment. The first one is soil chemical data. This is where they analyze the chemical composition of the topsoil. You don't need to worry too much about these specifics. This is just as a general example of this case study. The first is the chemical data, the soil chemical data. The next is the residuals of the first year's yield data. We go into residuals much later in the course, but this is looking at the discrepancy between your expected yield and your actual yield. And in this case here, this is just assessing those discrepancies between your expected and actual yield from the initial year. The third one is traditional fertility classification system. This assesses soil fertility and its potential impact on growth. And the final one is your plant vigor scores, which measure the overall health and vitality of the plants. So these are the 4 different data types used in this case study example to account for the variation in the pearl millet growth, to account for those differences seen in growth of this crop. Now, these 4 data types were chosen very carefully to account for this variation in the outcome. And one question I guess we could ask is, why these 4? Information goes into it in the paper, where they've looked at previous literature as well. And I really strongly invite you to have a little look into that to understand a little bit more of the processes behind making these sort of decisions. But the kind of key point here that we're focusing on in this topic is that any data types which were not included here have been actively excluded. These 4 data types have been included, but any that aren't here have been excluded. And that is a decision that's been made. They need to be able to justify why aren't other data types being looked at? Why are we not accounting for the variability by looking at the height of the pearl millet? Things like this. So which variables should we measure and which should we ignore? And there's no middle ground here. When we're planning and when we're looking at data, we need to look at and decide we either look at things or we don't. We either measure things or we ignore things. There's not a middle ground. This requires a lot of thought to determine the variables to measure the outcome in the study. All variables in this study are chosen to measure the outcome in order to answer the initial research question, while simultaneously have to be suitable, from a practical perspective. What do we mean by that? Well, let's go back to that example of let's measure our plant heights. Maybe that's not actually that practical here. Maybe here that's not easy to do. We don't have the tools to do that. We don't have the resources to, or maybe that's not suitable here for another perspective. Maybe that doesn't answer the initial research question, and so forth. And so in this study here, our researchers would have ensured that those 4 variables they chose to measure work practically. Questions they would have answered, are they cost effective? Are they time effective? Can they be ethically sourced? Are they ethical? Are they expected to be correlated with pearl millet growth? You could do one thing, which is cost effective, time effective, and ethical, but it's actually got nothing to do with the pearl millet growth. You could do things which are cost effective and ethical and related to the pearl millet growth, but if it's not time effective, then maybe you should consider ignoring that. You should look at your resources to decide which variables should we measure and which should we ignore. And for those variables that you ignore, they need to be justified. Some compromises may need to be made, but those decisions are best made at the start of the study. This is to maximize the usefulness of the study results. Here we only have and I say only, but it's, as we said, it's a 3-year study. But you don't want to waste that first year or waste any time there because you didn't think through this properly at the start. You want to start and you want to have that level of conceptualization to determine which variables you should measure and which variables you should ignore. So similarly, the experiment, and this case here was an experiment, but these ideas apply for all kinds of studies. So there's opportunistic studies, which are these are studies where you get the data, where you start with the data. So it might be that you have your kind of rainfall data, which is just given to you and you weren't involved in that design process. But you might have loads of variables in there and you have to decide which variables in that data set you're going to look at and which ones you're not going to. We might also, so that's an opportunistic study. It might also be with a survey, that you might have a survey on soil samples. So you go around to different farms and you're looking at their soil samples. And in there you need to decide, okay, how am I going to look at soil samples? Which variables am I going to measure here and which am I going to ignore here? Actually, soil samples would be the kind of variable there, I guess. It might be that you want to look at how different farms relate, how different farms perform in terms of their yield, and you do a survey on that. And in the survey, one variable you choose to measure is the soil sample. One variable you choose to ignore might be I suppose maybe height of the yield. That might be one you choose to ignore because you might have the different crops that are being grown in these different farms anyway, that actually measuring the yield doesn't make much sense here. And then our third type is an experiment. And so we go into surveys and experiments more later. And in the experiment here, we might, as we said here, this is an experiment. So we're looking at a treatment. And so the experiment focused on specific variables and treatments here. Any variables or treatments that are not included are therefore actively excluded. They are intentionally not included. If the researchers were asked about the exclusion of certain variables, they would need to be able to justify their choices based on the study's objectives and designs. For example, why didn't they measure the height of their yield? Well, they might be able to justify that by saying, well, that wasn't time effective. They might be able to justify that saying, it's not really cost effective to have people out there measuring the heights of this, when actually the 4 data types that we have chosen are more relevant. Thank you.